contributions. The refreshments, I'd like to thank the following people for providing those sweet treats. We have Ian Tuttle in the house. We have Ginny Rich in the house. We have Eileen Bohigian in the house, and Barbara Potter also was able to bake something on this 400-degree day for us, so we really appreciate that. And I think that's all of my announcements. I'd like to introduce our president, Bob Bentley, who has a few words for you. Thank you for being here tonight.
First of all, I want to welcome all of you, as David said, on this smoke-free day. We do have the air conditioning to hold out, and it's pretty comfortable. I would like to recognize our selectman, John Dixon, who's been instrumental in Quock Walker. Everybody knows it's Barre's 250th anniversary. It's the Barre Historical Society 107th anniversary. And Massachusetts has declared July 8th as Quock Walker Day. And Lucy will guide us through the history of this interesting gentleman. I would like to recognize we have some corporate sponsors. As we pass the hat, obviously we're a nonprofit, and we really appreciate the survival on donations. So we have some corporate sponsors that help us annually. CNC Pool, Cranston and Cranston, Hancock Cheese, Hopkins Bird Farm, Gibbs Brothers Insurance, Beacon Real Estate Solutions, R.J. McDonald, W.R. Robinson, and the Wild Hunters. I think that covers my portion of the speech, and with that, I would like to introduce our own historian, Lucy Allen.
Good job on that one. Yep, sure did. We try to get prepared ahead of time, and it doesn't always work. Okay. Can you hear me now? Yeah. Okay, that's good. All right. Well, it's lovely to see so many people on such a hot night. And as Bob mentioned, we have our selectman, John Dixon, here. And after the program, he would like to speak with anyone that might be interested in a potential Quock Walker Day Committee or other affairs related to Quock Walker. So if you're interested, you can speak with John after the program. So we know that Quock Walker is very important to our history of Barre and of our Commonwealth, but it's an issue of how do we honor a man whose image was never captured by a photograph or by an artist, whose voice had a powerful impact but was never recorded, who could not write his memoirs because he never had a chance to go to school, who lived in a world we can barely imagine, who was buried in some unknown place. There's no monument, no marker. We have no idea. There are guesses, but we don't know. And he led a very quiet life after 1783, when he played such an important role in the emancipation of slaves in Massachusetts. And yet he never seemed to have granted any interviews, or no one really recorded his story in his words. So it's difficult to come up with a lot of really personal things about Quock Walker. So we'll honor him today the way people have honored people for many, many years, which is by telling his story out loud. So, as Bob mentioned, it's our 250th anniversary of Barre, incorporated in 1774. That was the year that Quock Walker turned 21 years old, and his much younger brother, Prince, was born. So tonight we're going to visit with the family of Quock Walker. Many people have heard of his role in emancipating all enslaved persons in Massachusetts in 1783 by challenging his enslavers' right of ownership. This was a prolonged legal battle that covered 3 years, during which the issue turned from proving who owed Quock to judging whether slavery was allowed under the 1780 Massachusetts state constitution. Quock earned his freedom step by step, as did the other enslaved people of Massachusetts. Emancipation here was not a big to-do with celebration in the streets like we hear of Juneteenth in Texas. It was probably very quiet. It happened gradually over the course of about 7 years. And probably both sides, those who were enslaved and those who enslaved them, were somewhat nervous and unsure of what was going to happen in this new society. Some formerly enslaved persons were not treated well, others were. Some enslavers took the changes gracefully, others, like Nathaniel Jennison, did not. I have not found one newspaper account of 1783 in emancipation. It was just not a thing back then, and therefore we're looking at later records. In the 1790 census of the United States, which was the first time the country had ever been enumerated by a census, Massachusetts was the only state that had no slaves, absolutely none. And remember, at that time, Maine was part of Massachusetts, so they had none either. So we're looking back 300 years, and it's very hard to see back that far. Sometimes the scenery gets very cloudy and faded, and we try to imagine what was there. Sometimes we come up with things that sound reasonable, but we don't know if they're true. Quock's parents, Mingo and Dinah, were born probably in Ghana in West Africa in the 1730s and were brought to this country as enslaved workers. Their enslaver, James Caldwell, was born 313 years ago in Northern Ireland. So we're looking back a long, long way. And some of the things I say today will sound different from what previous Barre historians have said, because we have a lot more documents, much more readily available to us now. It's a lot easier with all the documents that have been digitized and on the internet to do a lot more research. But certainly, without the work before me by Helen Connington and Mary Kelly and Al Clark, and long before them, Matthew Walker, who was no relation to Quock Walker, I would not be able to do this program or to have done what I have done. I've been researching him since I was in high school, when Helen Connington would have me come up to the newly purchased Barre Historical Society and help her set up the files when I was a teenager. So that's a long time. So Massachusetts was in the rather odd position of being the first state colony, I should say, to legalize slavery, and the first state to fully abolish slavery in 1783. And as we know, a married man, Quock Walker, was instrumental in this change. So, you might wonder how slavery came to Massachusetts. They came in the early 1600s as labor, but under natural law, which is what the English used, slavery just wasn't right because natural law believed that everybody was free. So they had to pass a law to allow slavery, and it had the rather ironic name of the Body of Liberties. And the Body of Liberties that was passed in 1641 said everybody had liberties except it allowed for the enslavement of African Americans, Native Americans, and mixed race people. When we think of slavery, I think we often have images of slavery as it was depicted in the Deep South before the Civil War. with the slave quarters, the chain gangs, the huge plantations with people working in the fields. And as bad as it was, slavery was quite different from that in Massachusetts. It certainly was an abridgment of personal freedom. But in Massachusetts, although enslaved people were property that their enslaver could do pretty much what he wanted with, they were also legally recognized as people with certain rights. They could initiate lawsuits against their enslavers. Quock, Walker, and many others did this. Slaves could petition the legislature for freedom, which was done at least 4 times unsuccessfully in the 1770s. Enslaved people could marry free people. The children had the same status as their mothers, so if an enslaved man married a free woman, their children would forthwith be free. Enslavers could not excessively abuse their slaves, and they had to make sure they had adequate food and housing. And enslaved people in Massachusetts usually lived in the same household with their enslavers. That was usually just a few slaves in a family. There weren't quarters with slave cottages usually. But that was a social problem because often an enslaved man and wife lived a mile or so apart. So in Massachusetts, there were pathways to achieving freedom. You had an escape hatch if you were lucky, and not everybody was lucky, certainly. So some of these pathways of freedom were actually used by slaves who lived in Barre. An enslaver could free a slave voluntarily. This is how Esau Northgate, whose family eventually lived in Barre, achieved freedom. His master, Mr. Southgate of Leicester, freed him out of love and affection for the good service he gave him. And this is what Quock Walker thought was going to happen to him. He thought James Caldwell was going to do this for him. You could run away. Quock's father did it. Quock's brother Prince did it. An enslaved person could marry a free person who then purchased the spouse's freedom, and that is how Lucy Terry Prince, an enslaved woman from Deerfield, Massachusetts, won her freedom. And you could sue your owner, questioning that person's legal right to ownership. This is called suing for personal freedom. Elizabeth Freeman and Quock Walker are 2 Massachusetts enslaved persons who legally sued for personal freedom and won. So this is just a synopsis of Quock, how he earned his freedom. He was born about August 1753 and purchased by James Caldwell of Barre, then known as Rutland District, in May of 1754. James Caldwell promised him his freedom when he was 25, but James Caldwell stood under a tree in a windstorm and was killed when Quock was 10. So Quock claimed that James Caldwell's widow, Isabella, also promised him freedom, but at age 21. But then she went and married Nathaniel Jennison in 1769, and Jennison refused to honor these promises. And that was the basis for Quock's eventual suing for personal freedom. Quock lived with Nathaniel Jennison as he testified in his trials. In 1781, James Caldwell's brother John and John's son Seth convinced Quock that the new Massachusetts Constitution made him a free man. So Quock went to work for the Caldwells, and Jennison was absolutely enraged. He knew where he'd be. He found Quock, he beat him, locked him up in a shed. So Quock sued Jennison for assault and battery, and there was a whole slew of trials after that and appeals. But in the end, Supreme Court Justice William Cushing found that the Massachusetts State Constitution provides that all men are born free and equal, and therefore, how can they be slaves? So a lot of times people will say, well, Massachusetts was not the first state to abolish slavery, and my answer is that, in my opinion, it was the first state to fully abolish slavery, both on paper and in reality. We had no slaves in the 1790 census, but you will find states that say, well, Vermont had a constitution in 1777 that abolished slavery, but sadly, that was only abolishing it for adults, not for children. The other New England states had gradual periods where they would gradually abolish slavery, but New Hampshire didn't do it until 1857, Connecticut 1848, Rhode Island 1843, Pennsylvania says they're the first, but it was an act to gradually abolish slavery. So I feel that people looking at these things are looking for like a constitution or a law that says we are abolishing slavery. We never did that. Our Constitution did not use the word slavery at all. It said all men are born free and equal. And John Adams drafted that Constitution, and he knew darn well what he was saying. And some of the other people that participated in that were Quock Walker's attorney that argued his case, Levi Lincoln, and also Supreme Court Justice William Cushing that rendered the opinion. So they knew darn well what the Constitution meant. So, you know, in this case, it's we know that I think it was yes. But then you have the question, was Quock Walker's the decision, the only decision that made slavery abolished in Massachusetts? And the answer is no, because Elizabeth, who was called Lovett before Freedom, whose last name she adopted was Freeman, had a decision in 1781 when she sued her owner on the basis that the new state constitution said that, you know, didn't allow for slavery because everybody was free and equal. She did that in 1781. Maybe because it was in the Berkshire County Court, nobody noticed it. So in 1783, when the decision was rendered on Quock's case, that was the one that really tipped the scales. That's the one that people noticed because maybe it was a Supreme Court. I don't know. So Elizabeth Freeman and Quock Walker are usually seen now as hand in hand in getting this decision. Now, I get a lot of questions about Quock's life. Of course, we want to know how do you spell his name, and how did he choose the name Walker? Was he Prince's brother or his father? Where did he live after he was freed? Where he was buried? You know, I can give you some answers based on my research. Doesn't always match what other people have found, and I don't think we're ever going to know the absolute answer to these, but let's look and see what we can see. So, Kwaku in West African Ghanaian language means a boy born on Wednesday. So let's assume that Quock was born on Wednesday, and in the bill of sale, when he was purchased by James Caldwell, he was called Quacko, which is pretty darn close to Kwaku. Now, his name has been spelled many times over the years, and Quock could not read and write. I try to be consistent in using Quock just because I think it's easier. He is the only person in his family that actually had an African name. Mingo and Dinah and Step and Prince, Rosanna were names that were usually often given to slaves, and they were given by their owners, not by their parents. Why did Quock choose the surname Walker? Well, I know that there have been theories that he chose it because Dr. Asa Walker was his neighbor and was kind to him and treated his family. But the facts show that Quock used the name Walker in 1781 when he sued Nathaniel Jemison. And Asa Walker was only 17 years old in 1781. So he was not a doctor, and he was not Quock Walker's neighbor for another 20 years or so. So I don't think that's likely. I don't know why. Walker is a very popular name for former slaves. Maybe it symbolizes to them walking away from slavery. I don't know. Why didn't he choose Levi Lincoln's name or William Cushing's or the Caldwells? It's a mystery. Someday maybe we'll know. Perhaps it was assigned by the court when he sued Nathaniel Jemison, and he was told, you have to have the last name if you're going to a court case. The first known record of Quock is the bill of sale. And it's rather startling. It says Rutland District, May 4th, 1754, sold this day to Mr. James Caldwell of said district in the county of Worcester and province of the Massachusetts Bay, a certain Negro man named Mingo, about 20 years ago of age, and also one Negro wench named Dinah, about 19 years of age, with her child Quacko, about 9 months old, all sound and well for the sum of 108 pounds lawful money, received to my full satisfaction, which Negroes I, the subscriber, do warrant and defend against all claims whatsoever, as witness my hand. Zedekiah Stone was the seller, and the witnesses were John Murray and John Caldwell. So it tells us a lot about the world that Quock's family was entering. Barre wasn't incorporated yet in 1754. It was still called Rutland District. John Caldwell and his brother James Caldwell were Scots-Irish, which meant that they were people that had once, like 3 generations or 4 generations before, had lived in Scotland, went to Ireland to try it out for a few generations, didn't like it, came to America about 1720, seeking more freedom. They weren't popular anywhere they went. They were Presbyterians. They didn't belong to the established church of Massachusetts. They weren't Catholic, so they weren't liked very well in Ireland. And they were excellent fighters. They were feisty, and they were very good at fighting Indians in the colonies. So that's where they found their niche. But John Murray was also one of the Scots-Irish. Zedekiah Stone was not. But as of 1754, Zedekiah Stone lived in Nichwa, which is Petersham. So it is possible that Quock was born in Petersham. I haven't found that record, although in the trials, John Caldwell testified that Quock Walker was born in James Caldwell's house. So he could have been living there before he was purchased, or that might just have been an error of memory. John Caldwell was James Caldwell's next younger brother. He featured very prominently in the rest of the events through the next 30 years. John Murray lived in Rutland. He came as a penniless person, but he became very wealthy. So you wonder, how did they all know each other? Well, they were all soldiers for the British in the colonial wars of the 1740s and 1750s. James Caldwell rose in rank to major, and his brother John also fought in 1747. John Murray was James Caldwell's colonel in 1761. Now, John Murray was a very close friend of James Caldwell, and this also figures in very much into what happened over the next years. Do you recognize Colonel John Murray's home in Rutland? Okay, we now know it as the General Rufus Putnam House, but it was built by John Murray between 1760 and 1765. And in that period, he became the guardian of James Caldwell's children when he died in 1763. So this shows what a close friendship the Caldwells and the Murrays had. But this was a horrible stroke for the Caldwell family. In 1774, things changed dramatically because as we entered the fight with the British and the Revolutionary War, Colonel John Murray put his loyalties with the British. He fled Rutland, and his house was confiscated, and that's how General Rufus Putnam ended up with it. So Colonel John Murray was in a very nice social circle that included Judge John Chandler, who was his brother-in-law, and you'll see Judge John Chandler on an awful lot of papers if you look through the files of this family. Levi Lincoln, who represented Quock in these cases, was also one of these friends. John Chandler was also a loyalist who fled to Canada. Levi Lincoln did not. He remained in Worcester in Massachusetts and became acting governor and attorney general of the United States, so he did well. Lincoln helped draft the Massachusetts state constitution under which Quock was freed. So John Caldwell was also a good friend, And although he worked hard for the Revolutionary War cause, he was suspected of being a loyalist and was also jailed for a while because of that. His son, Dr. David Caldwell, had his property confiscated for being a loyalist. Zedekiah Stone moved up to Winter, Vermont, and I think he was on the American side, but I'm not sure. So there was a lot of disruption during the years when Quock was growing up. If you drive out Granger Road today, about 1 mile out on a dirt road east of Harwood's Crossing on Route 62, you will see a beautifully restored and modernized colonial home covered in gleaming white paint. That is not how it looked in 1900 when this picture was taken, but James Caldwell built it about 1750, probably for his bride, Isabella Oliver of Athol, whom he married in January 1751. I think his brother, John Caldwell, built it for him, because John was a housewright by trade. The house did not change very much in the first 200 years of its life, except the new barn built in 1939. The place was featured in Yankee magazine in May 1963 in a story about the Caldwell house being for sale. Quote, any house that stands straight and strong through more than 200 New England winters must, in our opinion, be a beautifully put together structure. It's on a fairly good dirt road, a mile off Route 62. The nearest neighbor and the nearest electricity is a mile from the house. Things are a bit rough inside, but the sills, roof, and chimney with 7 flues are in good shape. Things are, whoever buys it will have to put a lot of money into it, but we doubt if you'll find 20 acres of land in Massachusetts with a fundamentally sound house and barn on it for much less than the asking price of $5,500. So some of us remember that place before it had electricity when it was in rough condition. And the same aspect view of this last year shows how beautiful it is now after 275 years. And we're very fortunate to have in the audience tonight the current owner, Mike Jelinek, and it's been nice chatting with you. So this is, I'm sure he can tell you how much work it takes to bring a house like this back to life. When Quock's family moved to Barre, the house was almost new. Did they live inside this house? I think they did. We can't be sure. Some people, they think they lived in a rough cabin, which might have been the cabin that James Caldwell lived before he got married. But that was not the tradition, and there were several bits of testimony in the Quock Walker trial that say that they lived in this house with the James Caldwell family, including John Caldwell testifying that Quock was born there, and that several other witnesses saying that Quock had always lived in James Caldwell's house with him. We have a clue on this subject from the inventory of the James Caldwell estate taken after his death in 1763. The widow Isabel had to detail everything in the house, put a value on it. She listed the Negroes by name in the inventory, but in their sex and age, but not by name. And then she appraised the Negroes' bed and bedding at £1 to 6 pence. So it sounds like Quock's family slept in one bed together in this house. Now, when 1754, when Quock's family lived there, in those first years, up until almost 1800, there probably weren't very many stone walls there. We know from James Caldwell's probate record that Nathaniel Jennison built many Virginia split rail fences here. These fences were built by early settlers because they used up a lot of wood that you cut for clearing fields. After the rails were split, you needed no tools. You didn't need to put a post in the ground. You didn't need to cut a hole in the fence post to put the rail through. You just wove them like this. So James had 1,100 acres on his estate. He only had, as far as we know, this one enslaved family for permanent help. A man purchased in 1754 at the age of 20, his 19-year-old wife, and a 9-month-old baby. Does that sound like a very reasonable thing to do by our sense? Why would he hire a family with a baby, with a woman that would be tied up with a baby and not out working in the fields? Well, my feeling is that James Caldwell's first child, Sarah, was born in 1754. Dinah was probably still nursing Quock, and I believe that he probably purchased this family so that Dinah could be a wet nurse for his baby. Dinah kept having babies, Isabel kept having babies, and so there was just a source of milk for his babies, someone to take care of them. And given the remoteness of the location, I suspect that Isabel and Dinah delivered each other's babies, but that's just my own flight of fancy. I have no proof of that. But obviously, Quock could not do any real meaningful work until he was maybe 8 years old. And they had more children. 2 years later came Step, and then a girl that would be Priscilla. So these children are actually a drain on the farm rather than a help. But there were jobs that babies and children could do. There was spinning and weaving. They produced their own food. They produced their own clothing. Their relationships must have been very close, living in that house together, which is my belief. And this slide shows a colonial New England kitchen. See, that was where you had your big fireplace, the one warm room in the house. The chimney has 7 flues. My feeling that is, if we looked at James Caldwell's kitchen in the late 1750s and early 1760s, we would have seen the children playing on the floor here who were both white and black. So what did Quock do in his early years? Well, James Caldwell knew Quock since he was a baby. He must have seen something in Quock that was very unusual and special to promise him before he turned 10 years old that he would free him when he was a man. So Quock must have worked hard. He probably played with James Caldwell's children. But unfortunately, James was killed by a falling tree on July 18, 1763, just short of Quock's 10th birthday. He testified that he was in the fields harrowing, which I'll show in the next slide. It was not really unusual for a boy of this age to be doing such work, whether they were white or black. That was farm life. Farm boys did a lot of work. He would have helped reap the wheat, as you see in this picture, the hay. We know that James Caldwell grew potatoes, cabbages, turnips, Indian corn, wheat, possibly rice. They had milk cows, heifers, steers, oxen, horses, pigs, sheep. They kept bees. They had cider mill. There was a lot of picking up and a lot of chores, bringing firewood for the fires that a boy could do. And I think in the long winter days when there wasn't as much farm work, that Quock probably played with the other children, and maybe at times went fishing down in the river nearby. This was harrowing in that period. It was breaking up the sod with a frame dragged behind a team of horses, or oxen, which is more likely in Quock's case. Late on that Monday afternoon of July 18, 1763, a strong storm arose while James Caldwell and several other men were in the woods about 1/2 mile south of the house. The men tried to run for the house, but a tree felled by a strong gust of wind landed on James Caldwell and a Negro man, probably Mingo. Within minutes, Quock's father, Mingo, had a broken thigh, and his enslaver, James Caldwell, was dead. Quock must have heard the shouts of the men who survived. Perhaps he saw them run down the road yelling for help, alerting Isabel that her husband was dead. The man who was the father of her 4 children and of the 5th baby that was swelling within her. Quock's world fell apart on that day near his 10th birthday. Little did he know the chain of events that would lead to his unwitting role in the abolition of slavery. This is a news account from July 1763 from a Boston newspaper about the storm Obviously, there were very bad storms throughout New England that day. In the second paragraph, at Rutland, Major Caldwell with 2 or 3 men and a Negro, being in the woods, observing a gust coming on, endeavored to get home quick, but a tree blew down, and falling upon the Major and Negro, killed the former and broke the thigh of the latter. What kind of a gust can you see coming at you? Was this a tornado? We know of at least 2 tornadoes that happened right there by the Covered Bridge area. James Caldwell was 52 years old. He was in his prime. His death was extremely sudden and unexpected. Despite being a wealthy man and having a huge estate and many dependents, he was not prepared. He did not have a will, which is called being intestate. And when you don't have a will, the laws of intestate succession are used to decide who gets what. If he had left a will, it would have said, it is my wish that my slave, or would have said servant, Quock, shall be freed when he's 25 years old. He left nothing that said that. According to the laws in the Massachusetts colony at that time, his widow, Isabel, had a right of dower, or widow's rights, to 1/3 of his estate for the rest of her natural life. Remember that. And upon her death, her share would have gone to her children by James Caldwell. That provision for the rest of her natural life should have caused a very different legal case regarding Quock Walker if her rights had been upheld. The James Caldwell children together received the other 2/3 of the estate, with the eldest son, James Jr., getting a double portion. And these were the heirs to Isabel Caldwell's dower when she died, and not any husband that she married after James Caldwell. But that is not what Nathaniel Jennison told everybody. He told everybody that he inherited Isabel's slaves when he married her. And if she had gotten them through the will, that might have been true, but not because she got them through the dower. So when Isabel married him in 1769, they should have remained her property to go on to her heirs, hers and James' children. They should not have gone to Nathaniel Jennison. It would have been a whole different story if that had happened, but who was around to help Isabel? John Murray and John Chandler, the 2 champions, had both flown to Canada because they were loyalists. After she got her stuff together, after James died so suddenly, with 4 children under the age of 11 and a 5th on the way, she was a busy lady and she had a family of enslaved dependents, she ordered a tombstone from Boston's famous carver, Henry Christian Geyer. She paid more than £10 for this, and then she paid to have it sledded to Barre, and now it sits in the woods off of Granger Road, and it's very hard to find. And it is now illegible, so I'll show you what it says. This stone is erected in memory of the time when and place where Mr. James Caldwell died, which happened by the falling of a tree, July 18, 1763, in the 52nd year of his age. To add to Isabel's problems, like she didn't have enough, the one man who was on the estate, who she should have depended on, left her in May of 1765. Mingo ran away. We can imagine the pressure he must have felt trying to keep this estate going. We believe that Mingo returned by some means, whether he was recaptured or just came, because he was appraised in the inventory of the estate in 1768, at which time there were 2 more children in the Walker family from the inventory of 1763. So somebody was fathering them, and there was an adult male Negro. Names of the slaves were not listed. We cannot know with certainty that Quock, Step, Priscilla, Minor, Violet, Rosanna, and Prince were full siblings, or even siblings, but what we do know is that 6 of the 7 managed to maintain a strong family relationship. They took on the same last name, they signed deeds together, and Violet is the only one, if she was their child, who just simply disappeared. They went through a lot: the death of James Caldwell, Isabel's remarriage, her death whenever that happened, and the disruptions that resulted with the abolition of slavery in 1783. We don't know Mingo's fate, but Dinah Walker died in 1799. The town paid for her doctoring, a coffin, and the digging of a grave. Where? No, we don't know now. The three oldest children, Quock, Step, and Priscilla, led quiet lives after their emancipation, as far as we can tell. Three younger siblings, Minor, Rosanna, and Prince, seem to have been more active socially and in the community. Only Minor named a child after their mother, Dinah, and she named two children after her siblings, Quock and Rosanna. Prince seemed influenced in naming his children by his sister Minah's children. So only Violet's the only one I really can't tell you anything about, if indeed she was their child, but she was baptized on the same day as Rosanna and Prince, and she probably was. Wow. So this is my best ability to chart out their family tree of the children of Mingo and Dinah. 7 children, 6 I'm sure of, 1 I'm not. But here's one reason why we're never going to know. John Caldwell was a town clerk. His house burned December 1762, including all the town and vital records. The first minister of Barre was forced out, and he apparently took the church records with him. So the church records start in 1767. So the 1750s and most of the 1760s, we really don't have the records. So we don't have them for James Caldwell's children, we don't have them for the Walker children. They just aren't there. But by using various legal documents, we can establish relationships. Prince Walker, the youngest, born in 1774, made an affidavit that he was the brother of Rosanna Walker Ebbett, his next youngest sibling, who was born in 1771. When she applied for her late husband, William Ebbett's Revolutionary War pension. So those two claimed that they were siblings. They were the two that were born after Isabel Caldwell Jennison died. The most important document was a land deed for the sale of Quock Walker's land after his death about 1812. Under the laws of intestate succession, which he also didn't have a will, so he had the same problem. It had to go through this other process rather than inheritance. The people signing that will, which were Elizabeth, his widow, Elizabeth Harvey Walker, and then there were a bunch of other names, which were the 6 of these 7 children and their spouses. Either those were all Quock's children, or they were all other relatives. They would not have been a mix of children and siblings, for example. We know that the oldest ones, Step and Priscilla and Minor, could not have been Quock's children. They were just too close in age. So, just based on that, it would appear that they were all siblings of Quock and not any of them his children. There's no record that Quock ever had any children at all. No evidence of it. So, now most young widows like Isabella would have married right away. She had this 1,100-acre estate, she had all these kids, and she had the Walker family. But what happened was she didn't marry until 1769. She married on March 28th the wealthy Barre bachelor Nathaniel Jennison, who was 37 years old. He was also already had tons of land, but now he apparently had his eye on the James Caldwell estate. But this is what John Chandler, one of those loyalists that fled to Canada that could have helped her, wrote in 1769. And note, it calls her Isabel Jennison. She's already remarried. I do hereby accept of the doings of the committee by me appointed for the appraising of real estate, whereof James Caldwell, late of Rutland District, died seized and possessed, To the widow Isabel Jennison, widow of said deceased, her dower therein to be her held and enjoyed during her natural life, in which at her death, after a division among the proper heirs that may then be agreeable to law, I do also allow and approve of the division of said deceased's personal estate, which included the slaves, contained in said aforegoing return. This was on the 28th day of August, 1769. So he's saying that this stuff, even she's already remarried, it's hers until she dies. And then it would go to her children. And that is one of the really unusual things, is that we don't know when or how she died or where she was buried, which is a very unusual thing for a wealthy woman of that day. Nathaniel Jennison owned this house on Root Road. It is still standing. If you go down South Street, right on Root Road, it's the first house on the right near the power lines. But it appears that Nathaniel moved in to the James Caldwell estate with Isabel. Now, Nathaniel Jennison always comes across evil, and I've tried to think, was he really evil? Was there another explanation? And the best thing I could come up with is that he had a very bad experience with another young male slave just before he moved in here. His sister was married to Captain Edward Clark of Barre, and they had a slave named Arthur who was accused of assaulting a woman. Now, the woman did not want anything done to Arthur because she knew he would be hanged. But Nathaniel Jennison heard about it. Edward Clark heard about it, decided to take him off to Albany and hide him because he knew Nathaniel Jennison was going out for retribution. But Jennison chased after them, found Arthur and Captain Clark. He took Arthur back to Barre, stopping at Highwood Tavern to warm themselves up. And if you can believe this, Jennison said to Arthur, I'm going to stay here for a while. Why don't you walk back to Barre and I'll catch up with you on my horse. So guess what Arthur did? He went out, he stole Nathaniel Jennison's horse, and led everybody in the state in a merry chase for a few weeks. The story has a sad ending. He was indeed hanged in Worcester at the age of 21 on October 20, 1768, less than a year before Jennison went to live with the Caldwells. And I do think that he went into this house, saw Quock, who was just about 16 years old, and had visions of more bad experiences, and that it might have created conflict. Now, the last time I could find that Isabel was alive, when Nathaniel Jennison had his wife baptized as an adult at the Barre Church in June of 1771. So she died sometime around 73, somewhere between 72 and 74. No death record, no burial record, no grave, no probate, which there should have been a big lot of probate stuff when she died, because her share should have gone to her children. Nothing. Their children should have got that 1/3 share of the estate. They should have gotten the slaves. There was no notation in the outfit of the children's probate records. They were dressed up for their mother's funeral, which you usually find a wealthy family, the children are dressed to the nines for the funeral. Nothing, no gravestone purchased. So Jennison remarried in 1774. So presumably she's dead, but there are certainly some very strange circumstances that allowed him to get hold of all of this property without any record of Isabel's death. Just people say, yeah, she died. Well, she disappeared anyway. We do know that Jennison probably continued living at the James Caldwell estate because he was paying rent to the children. You see that in the probate record. And he built a lot of those fences. Now you wonder about John Caldwell, James' brother. Why didn't he get more involved in this? Well, he had his own problems. His house burnt down. He had a large estate He was a town clerk, justice of the peace, manager of his own large estate. He was a selectman and an assessor. But eventually he did get more involved in the lives of the James Caldwell children. He became guardians to a couple of them who had originally been John Murray's wards. He had reason to be concerned about what happened to this 1,100-acre estate next to his. He didn't like Nathaniel Jennison, that was for sure. So over time, we find that he became more involved. There was one child, the oldest, James Caldwell Jr., who had some problem, a health problem, and he was declared incompetent. He would have gotten a double share of the children's shares. His guardian was John's daughter, Elizabeth Caldwell, who was married to John Black. Now, there's also no death record for the son who got the largest share of the property. Once again, nothing. He was alive in 1784, but dead in 1787. So things just did not happen as they normally do. If you look through the lives of a lot of people of that time of their class, that just wasn't how things happened. The Caldwells were very tough people. John and James' parents lived to 99 and 96 years. James, well, he stood under a tree that fell down, but everybody else lived to their 80s or 90s. John Caldwell wasn't a perfect man, but he did, I think, get control of this land by marrying 3 of his children to 3 of James Caldwell's children. What better way to get control of that property? So, James's oldest daughter, Sarah, married John's son, John Jr., her first cousin. When John died, she married the second, Reverend Josiah Dana. James' son, who was called William, married John's daughter, Sarah, obviously, first cousin. And the last child, the youngest, Submit, who was born after her father died, married a son of Reverend Josiah Dana by his first marriage, who was her sister's stepson. And thus Submit's sister, Sarah, was also her stepmother-in-law. So, we have this family now very, very tightly connected, the 2 Caldwell families, and I think that's how John Caldwell assumed control over his brother's estate. And he also found a way to handle Nathaniel Jennison. We know that John could be a harsh man. He also had slaves, and he advertised for their runaways. But a book in 1856 by Charles Emery Stevens described that John Caldwell and his son-in-law, John Black, freed their own enslaved people before 1783. Together they built them a home for Mercy, who was enslaved by John, and Dick, enslaved by John Black. And we can confirm they were married. This couple would later purchase property close to where Quock Walker lived in South Street on Barre. So he did know what was coming. He knew that he had to free his slaves. And Levi Lincoln was his good friend, so he knew what was going on with the state constitution. Nathaniel Jennison married a wealthy widow, Mahitable Shirley, at Roxbury in 1774, who inherited his slaves, which she apparently brought to Barre. So Nathaniel ended up broke over all the trials, because she probably lived out her days in the house on Root Road, but she did have to eventually sell it for debts and move to Boston. So by now, John Caldwell's really thinking about how to help Quock, whom his brother had promised freedom at 25. Caldwell and his son Seth, who was 23-year-old, told Quock that the new state constitution said that all men were born free and equal, and he could come and work for them for wages. Why be a slave for Jennison? They would help him out. So Quock was working on Caldwell's farm and out on Colebrook Road up above Fruitland Road, when Jennison realized that Quock was missing from his own estate. And he charged up there and he found Quock and he beat him, and and basically locked him up in a shed. And he sued the Caldwells for interfering with his own property, which was Quock. For Jennison, the issue was that Quock was his proper slave, and he produced a bill of sale that James Caldwell had had. He claimed he inherited them from Isabel. Who was there to say this was wrong? Those who worked on his legal work of Isabel had all fled to Canada. So these lawsuits went on and on. Quock Walker sued Nathaniel Jennison for assault and battery. Jennison sued the Caldwells for interference with their property. There were appeals until finally the case reached the highest court in Massachusetts, the Supreme Judicial Court. Quock's attorney, Levi Lincoln of Worcester, on the left, pleaded that the issue was not about whether Quock was the proper slave of Nathaniel Jennison to do as he pleased with, but whether under the new Massachusetts Constitution any person could be enslaved. Remember, he helped draft this Constitution. William Cushing, one of the judges, agreed with Levi Lincoln's position. Both men were Harvard educated. Cushing went on to serve on the first U.S. Supreme Court, but the opinion he rendered in this case is probably the only well-known thing he ever wrote, and thankfully he did. Whoops. So this is what he wrote, and he basically goes through the whole drafting of the Constitution and why all men were born free and equal, therefore that is not compatible with slavery. That it doesn't matter what you look like, all men desire liberty, and that's why they did that Constitution. And unless a person forfeits his liberty by making some criminal act, then they are free. So we don't know when he actually rendered this decision. It was not July 8th because there was no Supreme Judicial Court. It was probably in April. So now Quock was free. 20 years had passed since the day that James Caldwell was killed. 20 years. That was a long time for a young man. He's now almost 30 years old. Are things settled? Well, not for everyone, because Nathaniel Jennison was still living on the James Caldwell estate. And the heirs of James Caldwell had to kick him out. They had to serve papers saying, get out. That didn't happen until the 1790s, 30 years after he should have been settled. So it was a long time for everyone. And this map just shows Prince Walker ended up living up off of Gilbert Road on a hillside that is not accessible by vehicle. This was the James Caldwell estate down Granger Road. John Caldwell lived on Colebrook Road, and Quock Walker eventually lived on South Street. The three surviving children of James Caldwell sold their portions of the estate, and the Harwoods bought that house in 1799, and that's why we have Harwoods Crossing, and that part of the town has the name Harwood throughout it. So Nick Caldwell, who was the youngest of the children of James Caldwell, who never met her father, sold part of her share to Prince Walker, Quock's much younger brother. So Quock Walker did live on the Barre Common for a while. He never purchased land there, but he sold land there. And so what I have found happened in Barre is that some of the former slaves were given little patches of land when they were freed, and they never got deeds for them, but they did get the right to live on them and sell them. But in 1786, Quock purchased land of Francis Nurse, and that land is at the entrance experience of Cook's Canyon on South Street by Galloway Brook. It mentions the brook and mentions the Reverend Josiah Dana's house, and the meeting house is partway in between. There's not much question about that. The land on the common he sold to John Ruggles, who had the Ruggles Tavern, later known as the Quock House. So I know that Al Clark believed that Quock was buried on Barre Common. They lived there in about 1812, was probably buried there, and I find the timing of that not correct. I think he lived out on South Street at that time. I don't think there's one way that we're ever going to know the true answer to that. I feel he probably lived on South Street, which was the property the widow sold about 1812 with the names of all the siblings on it. For a few years, and this is the only picture I could find of his standing, hid by a snowbank up here, we had a sign honoring Quock Walker on the little piece of Barre Common with a Welcome to Barre sign. It stood very high, and we had a few unfortunate incidents where people said we never had a sign, and they were standing right by it. It just wasn't a good placement, and it was eventually destroyed by a skidding car. So it is now badly damaged, and I am not comfortable with the wording on it, so hopefully we'll find a better memorial for Quock soon to get that done. This house is on Brogan Road. It's still standing. You probably recognize it where the sharp corner is. It's still a farm. And it's where Peter Lewis, who married Quock's sister Minor in 1792, settled and lived for about 20 years. They had 10 children there. Growing up, Minor was the only one of the siblings that could write her name. She was educated somehow, as was Peter, who came to Barre from Fishkill, New York, and was described as a mulatto. But like many minority families in the 1800s, they started moving to the cities, and the Lewis family went to Cambridge, where they became very well known. And there's even a little tiny section of Cambridge called Louisville after them. Peter and Minor's 10 children were well educated and involved in the much broader abolition movement. Joseph became a minister. Sophia married John Levy, the first black resident of Lowell, who was also Jewish. He became very well known in the field of abolition and human rights. The best known child of Peter and Minor Lewis was Quock Walker Lewis, named for his uncle, Quock Walker. Known in later life as simply Walker Lewis, he became a leader in the abolition movement and was very active in the Underground Railroad in Lowell, where he eventually moved. And he helped integrate that city school system in 1830. So this is the only representation I have found of the generation after Quock. This is his sister Minor's child. I have some other photographs. There are later generations, so who knows if Quock looked anything like his nephew that had the same name. So he had another of their sons had a son named George Washington Lewis Sr., who was born in Barre in 1824, and his son was the one on the right, George Washington Lewis Jr. These two men were the head stewards at one of Harvard's university's clubs, which took the place of their fraternities. This was obviously a very prestigious job to have. It was called the Porcellian Club. When the younger man, George Washington Lewis Jr., was about 20, he sued the owner of the Cambridge skating rink for denying him admittance solely due to his color. And the newspapers of Cambridge really gave quite a scathing account of how could they serve in politics and go in all the churches, lecture halls, and theaters, but not be allowed in a skating rink. So this case was brought by Quock Walker's great-grandnephew, the guy there with the roast pig, some 85 years after Quock Walker's legal case helped bring the end of slavery in Massachusetts. This oil painting of George Washington Lewis Jr. was done by the artist Joseph DeCamp of Boston in 1919, and it's called The Steward. When George Washington Lewis Jr. died in 1929, 10 Harvard University student members of that club served as his pallbearer. So we can see that the Walker family, some branches of it, the one that got education, went very far in their lives. Probably the person I find most information on and most interesting is Prince Walker. Now, Prince was born in 1774, the year our town was incorporated. He was the youngest of them, and he came back to Barre and lived here all his life. And so we have a closer feeling, perhaps, to him than with the others. I wrote this article back in 2019, and it tells of how we know from several accounts that Nathaniel Jennison took the youngest slaves, we know Prince was one, maybe Violet, to Connecticut and sold them because slavery was still legal for children there. But Prince was pretty amazing. He was taken to live in the household of John Watson, a very wealthy merchant in East Windsor, Connecticut. He kept track of how old he was. He wanted to escape when he was 21. Now, he was 9 when he was brought there. He could not read, he could not write. He somehow knew he was turning 21, and he heard rumors that he was going to be sold into slavery in Georgia, and he knew he would never escape if that happened. So he left one night, and he walked from near Hartford to Barre, wading across the Connecticut River. This was the house that John Watson built that Prince may have lived in. Not shabby looking, certainly, but Prince wanted his freedom. The runaway slave ad sounds quite a bit like the one of his father, Mingo, from 1765. 5.5 feet tall, and it says that he went off with a fiddle and some clothing, and this guy wants him back. Now, what's important to note is that he ran away in 1795, which was 2 years after the passage of the Fugitive Slave Act of 1793. Although there's no slavery in Massachusetts now, if a slave got to Massachusetts from another place, he could be returned to his slave owner if that slave owner came to Massachusetts and said, here's my proof I own this guy. So Prince was not safe, even though there's no slavery in Massachusetts. So we've heard stories about this from the man who wrote the book about Anthony Burns, a man who had a similar experience, but in 1854. Prince's former owner kept trying to lure him back to Connecticut. He kept after him. There's a number of incidents in his daughter Nancy talked about. They tried to come and steal him back to Connecticut. It didn't happen. So Prince spent his days pretty quietly living up on that hilltop farm he had of 7 acres that he bought from his former enslaver's family. He had 10 kids. They all got to go to school. He didn't. They went to the number 11 schoolhouse down on Harwood's Crossing. None of them probably have any survivors that we know of, but they did well. They were shoemakers, one was in the Civil War, one was a cook. So they were able to build lives for them in Worcester and in Oxford and Dudley. This is a trip we took to his home site up on top of the hill. It's nothing, it's just a depression. He had no foundation, he had no stove, he just had a fireplace for heat. There was no well, they walked down to the brook for water. His first wife, Betsy, died young. He buried her in a little aerial plot he made across the gully, and then 4 children were added to that and died young. 6 survived. He used just plain stones to mark the place. There's no engraving. He raised fruits and vegetables. He had an orchard, and he did odd jobs for people. He was well liked. He died when he was 84 in 1858. So he learned a lot of lessons in his life. Although he couldn't read or write, he left a will. He knows what happens when you don't leave a will. Before he died, he deeded his burial ground to the town of Barre. That was in 1854. But for some reason, that just got put aside, and it was not recorded until 1949, 94 years after the fact. The land all around it had been bought by the state as watershed for the Weir River watershed at that time. So it's like 1,000 square feet of town land surrounded by state land. And we're working on various ways to keep this burial ground safe now and preserved. The Cemetery Commission put in a new sign a few years ago. But we have some trees growing up there that are a problem. And this is probably the only African-American burial ground in a small town, exclusively African-American around. It tells a tale of courage and of deceit and of rising from hard times to work independently. This burial ground is really the only material thing we have left of the Quock and Walker family in Barre. The freedom that these people earned was very hard won. They had to work step by step to get it. It was achieved by walking from East Windsor, Connecticut to Barre, Massachusetts. It was achieved by daring to take your enslaver to court. So I know I probably said some things that are surprising because others before me have told the story a little bit differently. And I'm waiting to sit out there when I'm a few years older and hearing some young historian go over his or her research and telling how I'm wrong and that this is what he or she believes. But I will point out, if you want to come up and look at this display, why I am so concerned that our children don't get intensive instruction in cursive writing. This is what you have to read at a fraction of that size in order to figure these things out. So if you want to help a new generation of historians, please help them learn to read and write cursive. So that's it.
Couple questions.
Sure.
You have a couple quick questions.
Where is that Prince Walker burial ground?
It's,
Can you repeat the question?
the question is, I believe, where is Prince Walker burial ground? It is, if you go out Route 62, Harwood's Crossing, where Granger Road goes to the right, and Gilbert Road, which is sometimes gated, goes to the left. You go to the left about half a mile, and on an unmarked trail, you walk up the hill about a third of the mile. Yes. We have led several walks there. I don't give detailed instructions to people because I don't want them getting lost without having someone that really knows where it is. Our walk there last summer was canceled by a hurricane. I think we had 2 hurricanes and a tornado when we tried to walk up there. I'll try to schedule it soon.
Is it on private land?
Well, you have to cross, access is all over state-owned land, owned by DCR as the Weir River watershed. The actual burial ground, which is about this big, I mean, literally, it's tiny, is owned by the town of Barre. So access is over state land.
So maybe get it put on the register or something like that it's reserved?
That is actually, I'm going to put on my other hat, Historical Commission hat. We are working with the state and with the Barre Historical Society to try to find some way to preserve and secure this burial ground. The state is currently reviewing whether it is eligible for National Register. It's probably doubtful because of certain aspects, but that doesn't mean it's the only program that it might be eligible for help from. So we're working on that.
that tree is gonna destroy.
Yes, we're working on that. Unfortunately, you can't get equipment up there to take the tree down. So this is one of the access problems that we're working on.
Yeah. Push up the snow.
Yes, and we're aware of what's going to happen if that tree goes over, and two right near it have gone over, which is a real concern. Yes?
Did Levi Lincoln remain Quock Walker's lawyer throughout the entire legal review?
Okay, the question was whether Levi Lincoln remained Quock's lawyer throughout the whole legal. I believe he did, yes, but I'm not 100% sure.